Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is a very select audience, so some of you will already be convinced of the importance of classics, and some of you may be quite ready to be, I suspect. What I thought was that I should start with a story, which is going back to Homer. After all, where does one begin if one's a classicist other than with the great 8th century bard? And I was thinking about one of my favourite passages in the Odyssey, where Odysseus, having returned home after 10 years of fighting at Troy and 10 years being tossed around the world, returns to his palace at Ithaca, returns to his island, and he's disguised as a beggar, and he meets his old swineherd Eumaeus, and they're chatting and walking towards the palace. And then this is what happens. This is Odyssey Book 17. Lying on the ground near where they stood talking lay a dog, who now pricked up its ears and raised its head. This was Argus, whom as a young hound Odysseus had owned and trained before he sailed for Troy. In years gone by, the huntsman had taken him out to chase wild goats, deers and hares, but now with his owner gone, he lay aging and riddled with fleas on the heaps of mule and cattle dung by the palace gates, which was used to manure the great estate. As soon as he sensed Odysseus' presence, though, his legs were too weak to approach, but he wagged his tail and dropped his ears. Odysseus saw him, and his heart was wrenched. But he took care not to reveal his grief to the swineherd. Wiping away the tear that sprang to his eye, he said, "Strange to see a handsome dog like this lying in the dung. Was he a great hunter once, or just a show dog for his master?" "You can see," said Eumaeus, "that this is a dog whose master has come to grief. In his day he was marvellous for his speed and power, but now he's in a bad way. None of the servants bothers with him or grooms him any more. Half of the goodness is taken out of a man on the day he becomes a servant." So saying, Eumaeus entered the palace and made for the great hall. But as for Argus, as soon as he had finally caught sight of Odysseus, after waiting for him for 19 long years, he gave up the ghost, and his eyes were shut by death. So I find that, and I think a lot of students, when they first come across it, very moving, but also amazingly simple. The idea that the dog who's waited for his master should have to be there, maltreated on the dung heap, and dies as soon as Odysseus comes. Of course, Odysseus can't run up to him and hug him and do all the things that a fond master would do for a dog. There is something incredibly touching and human about that little vignette, as there are in so many cases in the great Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I think the key to why I think the classics is important is that it helps us to connect, and one way in which it seems to me that connection is brought about is precisely through this community of feeling that one might have about animals or children or other or tragic instances or happy ones. So it seems to me that the stories that the Greeks tell are, on the one hand, of course, remote from our experience, but on the other hand, like this one, extremely close, and that makes the kind of connection to our lives very close. Recently there's been a lot of talk about the fact that we now live in an attention economy. So we don't live in a money economy anymore or a knowledge economy, but in an economy where it's all about grabbing attention. So people who are happily tweeting away or on Facebook and so on are very good at that kind of thing. Attention is treated a little bit like money. It's something which apparently people can't get enough. It is a scarce resource. It depends on one person controlling the attention before someone else comes in and takes it away. And so I was thinking, well, where does the classics fit into this? And the answer, I think, is that the classics is something which commands our attention if, like that story, it's something that we feel is appealing, and it also repays our attention. So this is the kind of thing, it seems to me, that is actually worth reading, thinking about, wondering about the historical circumstances of, say, the 8th century BC in Ionia or on the mainland of Greece, where these stories were set. The other connection, I think, that is made with the ancient world is that I've spoken about Homer, but of course all of Greek literature is at the basis of Latin literature. So we find that although we don't really know what the sources of the Greek stories were, we can find some traces in Near Eastern stories and texts, but essentially we don't know for certain. With all the Latin literature which we study, and which is equally great and moving in some ways, we know that the Greeks were there, starting with Homer, as the great predecessors, the great literary predecessors. So when Homer begins his Iliad with the word anger, in Greek it's meinin, sing, he says, sing goddess of the anger of Achilles, the son of Peleus. That's taken up 7 centuries later by Virgil when he writes his epic about the journey of Aeneas for the foundation of Rome. So the Aeneid is a recapitulation in many ways, though a very brilliant revision of Homer's Iliad. And one of the first tutorials that I give at the beginning of term is on Homer's Iliad or on Virgil's Aeneid. It depends which I decide to begin with, but those are the two main texts with which the classics course here begins. And just as I ask about Homer's Iliad, what is the story about? It begins with the anger of Achilles, and by the end of the Iliad, in book 24, that anger is assuaged. And it's an anger initially against his own side because his concubine has been stolen by King Agamemnon. But that anger is diverted against his main Trojan enemy, Hector. And of course, after he kills Hector, because Hector kills his dear comrade Patroclus, Achilles' anger doesn't get alleviated. But eventually, there's a kind of rapprochement with his own side. Book 23 we have the funeral games, and then in book 24 there's this extraordinary scene where Priam, Hector's father, comes to the camp of the Achaeans and he begs Achilles for the body of his son. And Achilles, remembering his own old father, bursts into tears, and they both cry together, and there is that kind of amazing sense of peace at the end of the Iliad, even though we know the war will continue and lots more people, including Achilles, will die. So that's the trajectory of that great poem. And then when Virgil picks it up, it's about a different anger. And I'll ask the question, what is the Aeneid about? Whose anger is the Aeneid about? The answer isn't Aeneas, of course. It's about Juno's anger, the goddess Juno, who's angry with the Trojans, essentially for surviving, those Trojans who survive the sack of Troy and under Aeneas eventually come to found what will be a much greater empire, the greatest empire the world will have seen, that of Rome. And so the goddess Juno is the angry one, and at the end of the Aeneid, her anger is also assuaged. There's a council with Jupiter, and they decide that they will allow Rome to be established and to grow into this great city that it will become. But there's a wonderful pun at the beginning of Virgil's Aeneid, and that is the very first words spoken by Juno, because she is watching the Trojans escaping from Troy, knowing that their destiny will be fulfilled one day, and she's furious. And her first words are, "Am I going to give up my plan?" And in Latin, the "am I going to give up," conquered, is "mene incepto desistere victam." "Mene incepto desistere victam," she says. "Menin" are her first words, "am I to give up my plan?" Those words sound, of course, identical to the Greek word for anger at the beginning of the Iliad. Menin, which is the first word of Homer's Iliad. So that kind of detail I find fascinating, that the intimate knowledge of the ancient Greek texts on which the Romans based theirs show that we can have this interchange between the two cultures, a terrific connection which leads to all kinds of interesting new ventures in literature. Of course, one of the literary areas in which the Romans take Greek poetry is love poetry, and a famous exemplar of that is Catullus. Catullus, one of the great everyday colloquial poets of the ancient world, which I think all students love immediately because his poems speak directly to us. I'm just going to read one of them, poem 10, which is one of my favourites because it's written in a very conversational way. And again, it seems to encapsulate something, rather as Homer's story of Argus encapsulates something about the way human beings love dogs. This encapsulates something about the way human beings get on each other's nerves or try to show off. And Catullus is beautifully straightforward about it. He tells this story. He says, "My friend Varus saw me strolling in the forum and dragged me off with him to meet his girlfriend. A little scrubber was my first impression. Quite pretty though, not unfanciable. We got to chatting about this and that. They asked me what the news was from Bithynia." He'd been posted to Bithynia. "Had my time there made me lots of money. The fact is that not even top officials, much less their aides, could get the slightest bonus to add a measly penny to their coffers, especially since the governor was a bastard and didn't give a shit for his assistants. At least they said you won't have passed the chance up to get your share of local litter bearers." Keen to impress the girl and make her think I wasn't too uncool, I said, "You betcha, lousy place it was. It didn't stop me from bringing back my team of litter bearers. The truth is, I don't own a single porter, not there and not in Rome, not even one who could lift a broken bed leg on his shoulders. But hey, the little bitch says, 'Oh, Catullus, my darling, please lend them to me. I only need them for a day. I've got an outing to the temple of Serapis.' Hold on there," I stuttered. "I made a mistake. They aren't mine to lend. In fact, Kikinna, my mate, that's Gaius Kinna, they're his porters. Of course, they're mine to use if I should want to." God, what a boring cow, though. What a pest to hold a fellow to a casual boast. So that's Catullus, laughing at himself, of course. You know, came back from the provinces with a Ferrari. "Oh, can you lend it to me for a day? I've got to go to the temple of Serapis," which apparently was a temple where you would get cured from something. So there may be a suggestion here that the girl is going to be using his litter, because, of course, you could hide behind the curtains of a litter in order to go and get some unpleasant disease sorted. But of course, it turns out that he hasn't got a litter to lend her. Well, some of the poetry, of course, this sort of thing, because it's called lyric poetry, I mean, it goes back to a Greek tradition of singing songs to the lyre. That's what lyric means. In fact, all of Greek poetry, really, from about 800 to 400, was originally composed to be sung. And I think that that's an area which is underplayed in the classics. I think it's very important, and it's one that I'm about to embark on a 2-year research project about, to try and reconstruct the actual sound of that music and to show how important it was for the lyrics that survive. These lyrics from Homer through to the great poet Pindar and Sappho, all those lyric poets, and of course the lyrics of Greek tragedy, Euripides and Sophocles. They wrote their choruses to be sung and danced. And we have got, very few people seem to know this, around 60 documents of notated music. So we actually can reconstruct something of the melody. And we also know the rhythms, the very intricate, complex rhythms that the Greeks used and that were then adopted by the Roman poets, which of course form the rhythm of the music. And rhythm is as important, or more important in music, as melody. So to say we've lost Greek music is simply incorrect. In fact, I think that when Virgil begins his Aeneid, "I sing of arms and a man, arma virumque cano," people say, well, he wasn't actually singing. Well, why not? I mean, this is in rhythm, arma virumque cano troiaequi primus haburis. The hexameter rhythm is there, inscribed in the words, and maybe that's what Virgil means when he says, I sing. Just as if one of these rappers were to say, I'm singing a song, you wouldn't necessarily expect to hear a melody, but you would hear something rhythmical. Well, I've got a couple of poems here. One actually written by a modern Greek poet, a 19th century Greek poet called Mavilis, in which he takes the story of Kallipateira, who was, women don't figure that much in the ancient world, but they are important, and sometimes their importance emerges. Kallipateira was a Rhodian noblewoman who insinuated herself into the ancient Olympic Games dressed as a man, so as to watch her son compete. Women weren't allowed into the games on pain of death. When her son won his event, she jumped up in delight and revealed herself as a woman. So she was brought before the Olympic judges, and she cited the Olympic successes of her family members, in particular that of her father, whose name was Diagoras of Rhodes, who had a boxing triumph and had been celebrated in a magnificent ode by Pindar, his 7th Olympian ode. Now, an ode was a performance event. It involved instruments, singers and dancers. But the story is told by Mavilis here from the point of view of the judges asking Kallipateira what she's doing. O noble Rhodian lady, how come you here? Explain. By ancient custom, women are barred from this domain. I have a nephew, Eucles, who won Olympic fame. My father, son, 3 brothers are honoured for the same. So you are bound, good judges, to let me honour now those glorious men who wrestled to win the hero's bow. I praise their manly natures, no common woman I. My kinsmen shine forever with light that does not die. Inscribed on sparkling marble, their names will never dim. They gleam in golden verses, immortal Pindar's hymn. That's a sense of the honour that must have been felt by the athletic victors who were celebrated by Pindar. Pindar is immortal. He therefore immortalises the names of these victorious athletes. And the story goes on that the judges said, fine, you have a right to be at the Olympics. You won't be put to death. So it works. But something about that, my kinsmen shine forever with light that does not die, I think sums up the idea of the classics. The classics is the antithesis of what is instantaneous or modern or adventitious. It's something that doesn't die, something that can be repeated time and again. And the word classic originally means best of its kind, in a class of its own. And one of the reasons they're in a class of their own is that these poems and the literature of the classical world, whether Greek or Latin, is something that can be studied and repeated, and as I said, repays attention every time that happens. Well, the Greeks weren't always solemn, and I like the fact that they could make fun of their own traditions. And in the 2nd century AD, the Greeks were, of course, under the Roman Empire, but they were still producing poetry. And there's a lesser-known poet called Nicarchus, who writes rather amusing quips. So, for example, he writes about a friend of his who's a poet he didn't like. It sounds very, very solemn to begin with. It's called The Raven. The gloom of death is on the raven's wing. The song of death is in the raven's cries. But when Demophilus begins to sing, the raven dies. So he was followed by the Roman poet Martial, also a satirist, who writes a short quip, 2 lines epigram, in which he says, "You ask, why don't I send you poems of mine for you to see? The answer, so that you won't send your poems back to me." So you can see how there's some interchange between the Greek and the Roman poet. But what I particularly like about Nicarchus, he wrote a wonderful poem about a runner called Carmos. So this shows that the ancient Greeks didn't have to take athletics entirely seriously. When Carmos in Arcadia once entered in a race competing with 5 runners, he came out in 7th place. Astonishing, but true. Though you'll be saying, how in heaven, with 6 men in the race, did Carmos finish number 7? The reason is a friend of Carmos shouting, "Go, you're fine!" ran fully dressed around the course and beat him to the line. So Carmos finished 7th. But here's to his sporting health. If he had 5 more friends, just think, he would have finished 12th. So a quip, an epigram taken further to 8 lines, and I translated that in the same metre as a famous poem by Callimachus, one of the great poets of the Alexandrian period. They told me, Heraclitus, you were dead. He says, tears came to my eyes, it brought to mind the times we'd set the sun on our conversations. But, my friend from Halicarnassus in Caria, you've been ashes all these years. Your songs live on. Though greedy death commands all things to his realm, on them he will not lay his hands. That's a straightforward translation of a poem by Callimachus, but it was translated by a Victorian classicist called William Johnson Corey into this beautiful poem, which in a way becomes a classic in its own right. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old Carian guest, a handful of grey ashes, long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales, awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. I think there again a statement of the lasting nature of literature, of great poetry, what makes classics classic, and I think that is a good reason for us to want to study them and to think that the classics are still important. Thank you. I think it is crucial, absolutely crucial. I mean, I'm assuming that most people are not going to understand when I read these poems in Greek or in Latin, which in a way is a shame, of course. I mean, as a classicist, I'm bound to think that. But it does add a huge dimension to this poetry, I think, when it is read in the original languages. Now, the problem is that it takes years of diligent study to get up to a certain level in either Greek or Latin or both. And it can feel as if it's an endless task. So if one finds a new papyrus with a new poem, it's not easy simply to read it. One has to decipher it, one has to work through it. What I've done is I've taken care to translate this poetry in a way that I feel is immediate. Part of the problem with a lot of translation is that it comes across as a bit stuffy and old-fashioned, because these are the classics, and they've been translated for hundreds of years, and particularly Victorians were interested in translating them into English. So it seems to me that gives the wrong impression. I mean, like that poem by Nicarchus, which is just a very funny quip about the runner who is a heroic loser. You want to feel that this poetry comes across with an immediacy when you hear it. At the same time, it is very carefully crafted poetry in Greek and Latin. The metres are very complex. The care with which the poets have gone to fit the words into those metres is enormous. So I think one needs to try and do the same when one creates certainly a verse translation. But of course I would urge anyone to try and get to grips with the original Greek and Latin. It brings me back in a way to what I was saying about music. What one potentially loses is the music of this poetry if one just reads it in translation, especially if, as I did with the Homer passage, if you read it in a prose translation. If you read it in a verse translation, then you'll be getting a different music. You'll be getting the English music. So I translated the Movilis poem from modern Greek into an English rhythm, the Heraclitus rhythm that Corey used for the Callimachus poem. But that's a very English feel. It has a certain nobility to it, but it doesn't get across the same sense of the rhythm of the Greek. So, as I say, I would urge people to try and get to grips with Greek and Latin as well, the way the words work, the way they fit together, the detailed attention to what those words actually mean and their resonances. You can't get, obviously, from translation, but you can go some way towards it, I think. Well, I have been concentrating on classical literature, but of course history and philosophy and all the other areas of the classics are part of the connections that I was talking about. All these things are interconnected in the ancient world. I mean, to answer that question directly, I doubt that we have got any further than the Greeks when it comes to political difficulties. I mean, just look what's happening in Washington today. What we can learn from the ancient world, I think, is that these things have always gone on. We can learn in great detail from the great historians Herodotus and Thucydides how they saw the political world of their time, whether it was the world of tyrants or of kings, or indeed, of course, of the early Athenian democracy. You have the same sense that there are individuals who are doing their best for their people, and there are those who are trying to stand in their way. There are political dirty tricks. All this stuff has gone on forever. And one of the things Thucydides, the historian, actually says is that he's writing his history, very detailed history of the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BC, because human nature being what it is, this kind of thing is going to happen over and over again. And I think that's true. I think we can learn that things don't really change. Sometimes people will succeed, sometimes they will fail in politics, and you can't always tell what's going to make the difference. I mean, I'm just currently writing a book, finishing a book actually, in which I take my own classical monograph, which was called The Greeks and the New, in which I talk about how the Greeks were interested in innovating in all kinds of areas. And I'm writing a book for, as it were, a lay reader, to extract from that, from the various stories and histories that I tell in my academic monograph, what principles there are for innovators today. So principles for creativity and innovation. And it seems that they are the same things that you can recycle time and again. Connection is obviously one of them. You know, you connect two disparate ideas and you come up with an innovative one. Turning things around, flipping things around is another great principle of innovation. And one of the stories I tell is kind of a story of strategy in the 4th century BC, where the Theban general, Epaminondas, changed the disposition of the troops in such a way that he won a crushing victory over the greatest fighters of the day, who were the Spartans. And what does he do? It's very simple. Ancient Greek battles for hundreds of years had the same disposition of troops. You put your best people on the right flank. It was the place of honour. And that was always going to be the one which would break through the opposite flank and then wheel up the enemy. So what does Epaminondas do? He puts his best fighters on the left flank. I mean, it sounds laughably simple, but actually it took hundreds of years before someone thought, that's going to disrupt the opposite side. That's going to make them think, how come we're not winning on the side we should be winning, our right flank? You know, that's where our strongest fighters are. And as a result of that, he won a crushing victory with smaller forces over the Spartans. And then the Thebans in the early 4th century BC became the lead of the Greek world for a period. And they did the same strategy again about 15 years later in another battle. But at that battle, Epaminondas died, and nobody tried it again. It's as if you can do the reverse once or twice maybe, but then you have to go back to your standard formation. Yeah, I mean, I specifically steered away from that because I think if you want to make the case for the classics, it's easy to make it. And now there are statistics backing up the fact that classicists are more employable. Those who study the classics do better in all kinds of ways. I mean, some of the best lawyers, some of our top politicians are, of course, classicists. Some of the top people in corporations and all the rest of it. So you can make the case, you can show it statistically, and you can also make it in principle. After all, the classics is a whole world. So to study it, you've got to understand languages, you've got to understand something about history, you've got to understand poetry, you've got to think about the philosophical questions. It's a difficult, it's a large, it's a complex subject. To be able to get to grips with it, a classicist has to cover a lot of ground, do a lot of reading, be able to think concisely, very often be able to speak impromptu and concisely. And that is the kind of skill which, of course, is very transferable. Classicists learn to write, they learn to dissect language, they learn to be critical, analytical, all those things which anyone who's promoting classics as a subject can immediately reach for and say that's why classics is important. Now, the fact is that the humanities are important, that if you're studying history or languages or literature, they are equally to be justified on those grounds. The classics, perhaps because it connects and combines that many more disciplines, history, philosophy, art, language, literature, is harder to encompass. It's endless, and also it is very much at the root of so much of history and culture in the Western world, and of course in now the globalized world. So, I think all those arguments, those instrumental arguments, can be made, should be made, need to continually be made. I agree with you, there is a huge misunderstanding in the general mind, and it's not helped when otherwise intelligent ministers like Charles Clarke in the previous government say, why do you want to do something like medieval philosophy? The idea that they're a somehow useless academic subject is a terrible mistake. So thank you for raising that. Classics are important for all those reasons, but I concentrated really on the fact that the classics do give joy and repay attention.